Before history learned how to write its own warnings, there existed an empire so vast, so dominant, and so feared that its neighbors believed it had broken the natural balance of the world. It was an empire built on strength, discipline, and relentless expansion. Its armies marched farther than any before them. Its cities rose higher, its laws reached deeper into daily life, and its rulers believed, truly believed, that their power was not only permanent, but inevitable. And yet, this empire did not last. Not because it was weak, not because it was poorly governed, but because it was too powerful. Power, when stretched beyond balance, becomes unstable. And this empire stretched power to its absolute limits. Long before its fall, the signs were already written into its success. At the beginning, the empire was small, almost forgettable. A single city, surrounded by rivals stronger, richer, and older. Its people were hardened by scarcity. They learned discipline before they learned comfort. Survival demanded unity, and unity demanded obedience. From the earliest days, the state mattered more than the individual. This was the seed of its greatness. Every citizen served the empire in some way. Farmers fed the army. Artisans forged weapons. Builders raised walls and roads that could carry legions across entire continents. Children were raised to respect authority, law, and sacrifice. Unlike other kingdoms that relied on charisma or divine kingship, this empire relied on systems. Systems of taxation, systems of recruitment, systems of law, and systems, when perfected, can conquer the world. As decades passed, the empire expanded outward in calculated steps. Each conquest strengthened it further. New lands meant more resources. More people meant more soldiers. More soldiers meant more conquest. Victory fed victory. Enemies were overwhelmed not just by numbers, but by organization. The empire's armies moved like machines, disciplined, predictable, and terrifyingly efficient. Where other forces charged with passion, these soldiers advanced with precision. They built roads as they marched, forts as they conquered, and supply lines that ensured no campaign ever starved. Cities that resisted were crushed. Cities that surrendered were absorbed. Their elites were allowed to live, sometimes even to rule, but only if they submitted fully to imperial authority. This policy made the empire grow faster than any before it. Soon, maps struggled to contain its borders. From deserts to mountains, coastlines to deep forests, the empire ruled lands it barely understood. Dozens of cultures, hundreds of languages, countless traditions, all folded under one banner. And at first, this diversity was a strength. Taxes flowed in. Trade exploded. Rare goods moved across thousands of miles. Wealth accumulated in imperial capitals beyond imagination. Temples, palaces, and monuments were constructed not just to inspire awe, but to send a message. This empire was eternal. But eternity demands restraint. And restraint was something the empire never learned. With each new conquest, the cost of maintaining control increased. Garrisons had to be stationed. Governors appointed. Roads repaired. Borders defended. What had once been a compact, manageable state became an administrative giant. To hold it together, the empire tightened its grip. Taxes increased. Military service expanded. Laws grew harsher. Surveillance became routine. Rebellion, once rare, became common and brutally suppressed. The empire's strength was now being used not just against enemies abroad, but against its own people. At the top, emperors, or kings, or councils, became increasingly detached from reality. Surrounded by wealth and protected by layers of power, rulers believed their authority was absolute. Advice that questioned expansion was ignored. Generals who warned of overreach were sidelined. After all, the empire had never lost. Every crisis had been solved by more force. So when problems arose, force was applied again, and again, and again. But power is not infinite. It draws from human labor, loyalty, and belief. As decades turned into centuries, cracks began to form beneath the surface. The army, once loyal to the state, grew loyal to commanders instead. Soldiers who spent their lives conquering foreign lands began to realize they held real power. Some generals became kingmakers. Others became kings themselves. Civil wars erupted, not between nations, but within the empire's own borders. Each internal conflict weakened the whole. Meanwhile, conquered peoples who had once accepted imperial rule began to resist more fiercely. They had learned the empire's methods. They knew its weaknesses. Supply lines could be cut. Garrisons could be isolated. Roads that once enabled control now enabled rebellion. The empire responded the only way it knew how, with more power, more troops, more laws, more punishment. But repression breeds resentment faster than it restores order. Economically, the empire began to strain. The costs of defense soared as borders stretched thinner. Coinage was debased to pay soldiers. Inflation followed. Trade routes became dangerous. Merchants withdrew. Cities shrank. The very infrastructure that had once made the empire unstoppable now became a burden. Roads had to be maintained across thousands of miles. Walls needed constant repair. Forts required supplies that no longer arrived on time. And still, expansion continued. Because stopping would have meant admitting limits. The empire had built its identity on growth. Without conquest, the army had no purpose. Without new wealth, the state could not sustain itself. Without enemies, internal divisions became impossible to ignore. So the empire pushed outward, into harsher lands, stronger enemies, and territories that offered little return. Each victory cost more than it gained. At the same time, the empire's culture began to decay from within. The values that had once created unity, discipline, sacrifice, service, were replaced by excess and corruption at the top. Wealth concentrated among elites who no longer understood the lives of ordinary citizens. Trust eroded. People still feared the empire, but they no longer believed in it. And belief is the invisible foundation of power. When external pressures finally arrived, migrating peoples, rival states, environmental changes, the empire was already exhausted. Its armies were stretched thin. Its treasury was drained. Its people were divided. The empire tried to respond as it always had, with force. But force, without stability, becomes chaos. Defeats that would once have been minor became catastrophic. Provinces broke away. Borders collapsed not in dramatic battles, but through neglect. One region at a time simply stopped obeying. The center could no longer command the edges. And then, almost suddenly, the empire was gone. Not erased in a single night, but hollowed out, piece by piece, until the name remained but the power did not. What had once ruled the world became a memory, a warning carved into ruins and broken roads. Historians would later argue about the cause of its fall. Corruption, invasions, economic collapse, moral decay. But all of these were symptoms. The true cause was imbalance. The empire grew faster than it could adapt. It accumulated power faster than it could control. It believed dominance was the same as stability. And in doing so, it created a system so vast, so rigid, and so demanding that it could survive only through constant expansion. The moment expansion became impossible, collapse became inevitable. This is the paradox of overwhelming power. The stronger an empire becomes, the more it depends on that strength. The more it conquers, the more it must control. And eventually, the weight of its own success becomes unbearable. This ancient empire was not destroyed by its enemies. It was destroyed by the limits of power itself. And that is why it did not last. After the empire's apparent collapse, life did not simply end. Instead, it changed, slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. What vanished was not civilization itself, but the central authority that once held everything together. Roads still existed, cities still stood, and people still remembered what it meant to live under imperial rule. But memory is not power, and structure without enforcement becomes fragile. Former provinces adapted in different ways. Some regions fractured into smaller kingdoms ruled by local strongmen who once served the empire. Others attempted to preserve imperial traditions, copying its laws, titles, and symbols, even as the real strength behind them faded. In distant territories, imperial identity dissolved entirely, replaced by older customs that had never truly disappeared. This fragmentation revealed a hidden truth. The empire had never truly unified its world. It had controlled it. Control can be imposed. Unity must be built. For generations, imperial administrators had governed through obedience, not participation. Local cultures were tolerated but rarely integrated. Loyalty was demanded, not earned. When the central power weakened, there was no deep bond strong enough to hold the system together. The empire's greatest achievement, absolute authority, became its greatest weakness. As centuries passed, historians tried to understand how something so dominant could fail. They studied military defeats, economic breakdowns, and political intrigue. But beneath every explanation lay the same pattern. The empire had expanded faster than its institutions could mature. Every conquest added complexity. Every new province introduced unfamiliar customs, beliefs, and needs. Instead of adapting, the empire standardized. One law, one system, one authority for all. What worked in the core regions failed at the edges. What stabilized the center destabilized the frontier. To maintain order, the empire relied increasingly on fear. Fear is effective, but only temporarily. When fear replaces trust, loyalty disappears the moment enforcement weakens. And enforcement, across vast distances, is expensive. The empire spent enormous resources moving armies not to conquer new lands, but to hold onto old ones. Soldiers guarded borders that no longer mattered, protected cities that no longer produced wealth, and enforced laws that no one believed in. Eventually, the army became less a shield and more a burden. Recruitment standards fell. Training declined. Mercenaries replaced citizens. Soldiers fought for pay rather than purpose. Discipline weakened. Commanders competed for influence. Political loyalty shifted from the state to individuals. The empire had created a military so powerful that it became a political force of its own. And once the army began choosing rulers instead of serving them, stability vanished. At the same time, the economy, once the engine of imperial dominance, began to unravel. Long-distance trade depended on security. When roads became unsafe and borders unstable, merchants withdrew. Local economies shrank. Cities that once thrived on imperial commerce declined rapidly. To compensate, rulers raised taxes. Higher taxes pushed farmers off their land. Small producers collapsed. Wealth concentrated among elites who were exempt from the burden. Social inequality widened. Discontent grew. The empire responded predictably. More laws. More enforcement. More punishment. But law without legitimacy becomes oppression. As faith in the system eroded, people stopped seeing the empire as a source of order and began seeing it as a source of suffering. Loyalty turned into resentment. Service turned into survival. In many regions, imperial authority survived in name only. Officials collected taxes but offered little protection. Garrisons demanded supplies but failed to defend against raids. The empire was still present, but no longer effective. When external pressures intensified, whether migrating populations, rival states, or environmental stress, the weakened system could not respond cohesively. Each region acted independently. Coordination failed. Strategic depth disappeared. The empire did not fall all at once. It unraveled. One province stopped paying taxes. Another refused military service. A third declared autonomy. The center protested, threatened, then ignored. Eventually, even the capital was no longer the heart of the empire, just another city living off its past. Yet the legacy of this ancient power did not vanish. Its influence endured long after its political collapse. Later civilizations adopted its laws, admired its architecture, copied its military tactics, and studied its mistakes. Because the empire had answered a question humanity still struggles with. How much power is too much? The empire proved that dominance alone cannot sustain a civilization. That expansion without balance leads to fragility. That systems built for control must eventually learn flexibility or break under their own weight. Its story is not one of sudden catastrophe, but of slow exhaustion. An empire that conquered everything, except its own limits. And in that failure, it left behind one of history's most enduring lessons. Long after the empire's political authority faded, its shadow continued to shape the world it once ruled. Ruins stood where power had once been unquestioned. Roads stretched across landscapes no longer unified. Laws were remembered, repeated, and misunderstood. People lived among the remains of greatness, often unaware that what surrounded them had once been part of a single, unstoppable system. This lingering presence created a dangerous illusion. For centuries, new rulers believed they could restore what was lost. Kings and warlords claimed imperial titles. They wore its symbols, copied its ceremonies, and spoke its language of authority. But none could recreate its power. They inherited the shell, not the structure. Because the empire had not been a single achievement, it had been a balance. When that balance broke, it could not simply be rebuilt. The empire's collapse revealed how deeply it had depended on constant motion. Expansion had been its lifeblood. Victory had justified its existence. The moment conquest slowed, everything else began to fail. Soldiers without campaigns turned inward. Administrators without new resources became corrupt. Citizens without purpose lost faith. This was not accidental. It was designed. From the beginning, the empire's institutions were created to grow, not to pause. There were no mechanisms for decline, consolidation, or retreat. Every solution involved more control, more territory, more force. Growth was not a policy, it was an identity. And identities, once fixed, are difficult to change. As time passed, regional powers emerged from the empire's remains. Some were smaller but more adaptable. Others were weaker but more resilient. They learned from the empire's mistakes. They ruled closer to their people. They limited their borders. They valued stability over dominance. Ironically, these successor states survived longer than the empire itself. Because survival requires restraint. Historians later recognized a pattern shared by many ancient superpowers. The most successful empires are often the least flexible. Their systems are optimized for control at scale, not adaptation to change. When conditions shift, economically, environmentally, or socially, rigid systems fracture. The empire had been unstoppable in a predictable world. But the world is never predictable forever. Climate shifts altered harvests. Migration patterns changed borders. Trade routes moved. New technologies reshaped warfare. Each change demanded adaptation. And each time, the empire responded with the same tools that had once guaranteed success. Force, centralization, uniformity. These tools no longer worked. Worse still, they accelerated decline. Centralization slowed decision-making. Uniform laws ignored local realities. Force alienated populations whose cooperation was essential for survival. The empire began fighting the world instead of understanding it. And the world, patiently. By the time later chroniclers described the empire's end, they spoke less of defeat and more of inevitability. The fall was not dramatic. There was no single battle, no final emperor, no clear moment of collapse. Instead, there was silence. Administrative records stopped. Coinage changed. Borders vanished from maps. The empire did not fall, it faded. Yet its story endures because it speaks to a universal truth. Power is not the same as permanence. The empire believed that strength alone could secure eternity. That fear could replace loyalty. That control could substitute for unity. For a time, it was right. For generations, its dominance reshaped the world. But strength without balance creates fragility. Control without consent breeds resistance. Expansion without limits invites collapse. This ancient empire was too powerful to last, not because power is inherently destructive, but because unchecked power consumes the very foundations it depends on. It conquered lands faster than it could integrate them. It enforced obedience more effectively than it earned trust. It built systems for domination, not endurance. And when those systems finally failed, nothing stood beneath them. Today, The ruins remain as silent witnesses. Stones that once symbolized eternity now crumble under open skies. Roads that once carried armies now carry memory. And the empire that once believed itself immortal survives only as a lesson written across centuries. That no empire, no matter how powerful, can outgrow the limits of balance. As generations passed, the memory of the empire transformed from lived experience into legend. What had once been feared became admired. What had once been resisted became romanticized. Poets spoke of its glory. Scholars debated its brilliance. Leaders envied its reach. Yet few truly understood the cost at which that power had been achieved, or the fragility hidden beneath it. The empire's story was often told backward, beginning with its greatness and ending with its fall. But to understand why it was too powerful to last, one must examine how its dominance reshaped the psychology of both rulers and ruled. Absolute power does not only change nations. It changes minds. Within the imperial core, citizens grew accustomed to order imposed from above. Decisions were made far away by people they would never meet. Over time, political participation faded. Responsibility shifted upward. When crises emerged, people waited for authority to respond, authority that no longer functioned. Dependence replaced resilience. At the top, rulers developed a dangerous confidence. Surrounded by bureaucracy and guarded by armies, they experienced reality through reports and ceremonies. Failures were hidden. Successes exaggerated. Honest criticism disappeared. The empire became a mirror that reflected only what leaders wanted to see. This distortion delayed reform. When warnings finally reached the center about declining revenues, unstable borders, or social unrest, they were dismissed as exaggerations. After all, the empire had always survived. It always would. This belief became doctrine. The empire did not plan for loss. It did not prepare for contraction. It did not imagine a world without itself. So when contraction arrived, it was unmanageable. As borders shrank, the empire faced a paradox. Letting go of territory weakened prestige, but holding it drained resources. Every decision created loss. Every solution accelerated decline. Leaders responded by prioritizing appearances over reality, maintaining the image of control even when control was gone. This illusion of power fooled enemies, allies, and even the empire itself. Meanwhile, life at the fringes changed rapidly. Frontier regions, once heavily militarized, were abandoned or left underdefended. Local communities took survival into their own hands. They formed alliances outside imperial authority. Loyalty shifted from distant capitals to nearby leaders who could offer protection. The empire's absence was filled by something else. And once replaced, authority rarely returns. Culturally, the empire's legacy fractured as well. Its language persisted in administration and religion, but everyday speech evolved. Its laws were quoted but selectively enforced. Its symbols lost meaning. What had once unified identity now became hollow tradition. This cultural hollowing mirrored the political one. Over time, the empire existed only as an idea, a memory invoked to justify new ambitions. Future rulers pointed to its greatness as proof that domination was possible, even desirable. Few acknowledged that the same forces that created that greatness had also destroyed it. History, after all, often celebrates success more loudly than it studies failure. Yet embedded in the empire's story is a warning that transcends its time. Power that grows faster than wisdom becomes dangerous. Systems built for control struggle to evolve. And civilizations that mistake dominance for stability place themselves on borrowed time. The ancient empire did not fail because it lacked intelligence or strength. It failed because it refused to accept limits. It believed its systems were perfect, its authority unquestionable, its future guaranteed. The moment a civilization believes it has solved the problem of survival, it stops adapting. And adaptation is the only true defense against time. This is why the empire's collapse still matters. Not as a tragedy of the past, but as a pattern that repeats. Empires rise on discipline, organization, and ambition. They fall when those same traits harden into rigidity. The empire was too powerful to last because it mistook control for harmony, expansion for progress, and fear for loyalty. Its ruins whisper the same message across centuries. No civilization escapes the consequences of imbalance. By the time the empire existed only in memory, the world it once dominated had already moved on. New powers rose not by copying its scale, but by rejecting it. Smaller states learned to govern within limits. They traded dominance for durability. Where the empire had centralized everything, its successors diversified. Where it had imposed uniformity, they allowed variation. These choices were not always ideal, but they were adaptive. The empire had proven what absolute power could achieve. Its successors proved what absolute power could not sustain. In the centuries that followed, scholars tried to define the exact moment the empire fell. Some pointed to the loss of a capital, others to the death of a ruler, some to the abandonment of a frontier. But all these moments were symbolic. The true collapse had occurred long before, when the empire lost the ability to reform itself. Reform requires humility. Humility is rare in dominance. The empire had built institutions that rewarded obedience over innovation. Advancement came from enforcing rules, not questioning them. Over time, creativity withered. Solutions became repetitive. Problems grew more complex, but responses remained simple. Force, control, expansion. When these failed, there were no alternatives. The empire also suffered from scale-induced blindness. What worked in one region was applied everywhere. Local governors followed orders even when they made no sense. Reporting problems became risky. Silence became safer than honesty. This distorted feedback loop left leaders blind to reality. By the time reality forced itself into view, it was irreversible. Another silent factor in the empire's decline was time itself. Systems designed for short-term efficiency often degrade under long-term stress. Roads crumble. Bureaucracies bloat. Traditions lose meaning. What once required constant attention was assumed to be permanent. Maintenance was neglected. Power, like infrastructure, must be maintained, or it collapses. The empire expanded faster than it could maintain itself. Every new territory added responsibilities that were never fully met. Over centuries, this neglect compounded. Small failures accumulated into systemic collapse. And yet, even in decline, the empire influenced everything around it. Its legal concepts shaped future governance. Its military organization inspired later armies. Its architecture became a model of authority. Its mistakes became case studies, though rarely acknowledged as such. The empire's greatest legacy was not what it built, but what it revealed. That dominance creates fragility. That scale demands adaptation. That power without restraint erodes itself. This is why the empire fascinates historians. Not because it fell, but because it fell after doing everything right by the standards of conquest. It had discipline. It had wealth. It had organization. It had fear. What it lacked was balance. And balance cannot be conquered. The empire believed history belonged to the strong. In reality, history belongs to those who can change. As long as power remained useful, the empire thrived. When power became a burden, it collapsed under its own weight. This is the final paradox of overwhelming strength. The more power an empire accumulates, the harder it becomes to let go of any part of it. And the inability to let go is often what ensures the fall. The ancient empire did not fail because it reached too far. It failed because it never learned when to stop. When the last echoes of imperial authority finally disappeared, what remained was not emptiness, but transformation. The world reorganized itself along new lines, smaller, slower, and more cautious. People adapted to life without a single dominating force. Power fragmented. Responsibility localized. Survival became personal again. This transition was not peaceful, nor was it immediate. It was marked by uncertainty, conflict, and experimentation. But within this chaos lay the seeds of resilience. The empire had created a world dependent on central control. Its absence forced communities to rediscover self-governance. Villages defended themselves. Cities negotiated their own alliances. Trade routes adjusted to new realities. Authority became closer, more visible, and often more accountable. Ironically, life in many regions eventually stabilized, sometimes even improved. This was not because the empire had been evil, but because its scale had outgrown human limits. No system, no matter how efficient, can indefinitely manage millions of lives across vast distances without losing responsiveness. The empire had reached that threshold. Its rulers once believed that power could replace adaptability, that control could substitute for understanding, that fear could maintain order forever. History proved otherwise. Over time, the empire became a symbol, not of failure, but of excess. It showed how far organization and discipline could take a civilization. It also showed where those same strengths break down. Later empires studied its rise carefully. They admired its methods. They copied its strategies. And many repeated its mistakes. Because ambition is easier to inherit than restraint. Each new power believed it would succeed where the ancient empire failed. That it had learned the lesson. That it would manage expansion better. That it would balance authority with flexibility. Some lasted longer. None escaped the pattern entirely. The ancient empire's story endures because it reflects a truth about human systems. We build structures to solve problems. When those structures succeed, we trust them completely. When conditions change, we cling to them anyway. And clinging is often more dangerous than collapse. The empire's fall was not sudden, dramatic, or heroic. It was gradual, administrative, and deeply human. It failed because people made rational decisions within a flawed system, decisions that made sense individually but destroyed balance collectively. This is how great powers usually end. Not with thunder, but with paperwork, delays, shortages, and silence. The empire that was too powerful to last teaches us that sustainability is not about maximum strength. It is about measured strength. Not about total control, but about shared responsibility. Not about endless growth, but about knowing when growth becomes risk. Its ruins are reminders carved into stone. Power can build wonders, but only balance allows them to endure. As the centuries stretched onward, the empire's story became less about what it was and more about what it represented. It transformed into a reference point, a benchmark against which all later powers measured themselves. Its name became synonymous with dominance. Its fall became shorthand for overreach. Yet what most retellings missed was the quiet complexity of its ending. There was no single villain, no singular mistake, no moment when everything could have been reversed with one better decision. The empire was the product of thousands of choices made across generations, each logical in its own time, each contributing a small piece to an unstoppable trajectory. This is what made it so powerful. And this is what made it impossible to save. The empire had optimized itself for conquest. Its administrative systems rewarded expansion. Its military doctrine assumed constant engagement. Its economy depended on new territories to fund old obligations. Its politics revolved around projecting strength. Once these systems matured, they could not be dismantled without collapse. Every attempt at reform threatened entrenched interests. Every reduction in military spending weakened defense. Every concession to local autonomy undermined central authority. Leaders faced impossible trade-offs. So they delayed. Delay became policy. Problems that required structural change were treated as temporary setbacks. Emergency measures became permanent. Exceptional powers became routine. Each generation passed unresolved strain to the next, assuming future leaders would handle it. They never did. By the time meaningful reform was unavoidable, the empire no longer had the cohesion to implement it. Resistance came from elites who benefited from the status quo, from soldiers who feared loss of privilege, and from citizens who no longer trusted the system. Reform without trust is revolution. And revolution was something the empire was built to suppress, not survive. As power slipped away, the empire's leaders doubled down on symbolism. Grand ceremonies continued. Titles were preserved. Laws were issued that no one enforced. The image of continuity masked the reality of disintegration. This disconnect accelerated decline. When people no longer believe in institutions, they stop sustaining them. Taxes go unpaid. Orders go ignored. Defense becomes local. The empire ceased to function not because it was attacked, but because it was no longer believed in. Belief had once been its greatest strength. People believed in the empire's order, its justice, its inevitability. When that belief faded, fear alone could not replace it. And fear, without belief, breeds defiance. In its final phase, the empire became reactive. It responded to crises rather than preventing them. It chased rebellions rather than addressing causes. It defended borders that no longer mattered while neglecting internal cohesion. The empire was fighting shadows. History remembers this stage as decline, but for those living through it, it felt like normality slowly slipping out of reach. There was no announcement of collapse. Only fewer services. Less security. More uncertainty. And then, one day, the empire simply wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed, irrelevant. This is the fate of systems that confuse power with permanence. The ancient empire was too powerful to last because it built a world that depended entirely on its continued dominance. When dominance became unsustainable, nothing else could take its place. Its story is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. As the final traces of imperial authority dissolved, the world entered a long period of recalibration. People who had lived under a single dominant power for generations now faced a quieter, more uncertain reality. There were no longer imperial messengers bringing orders from afar, no standardized laws enforced by distant officials, no overwhelming armies guaranteeing peace. What replaced the empire was not chaos alone, but diversity. Different regions evolved in different directions. Some became fiercely independent. Others formed loose alliances. Some revived older traditions buried under centuries of imperial rule. In many places, governance became more personal, more local, and more responsive, though often less secure. This shift revealed something the empire had never accepted. Human societies are not uniform. The empire had tried to force diversity into a single shape. It believed order required sameness. That stability depended on standardization. That difference was inefficiency. For a time, this worked. But over centuries, the suppressed differences resurfaced. Languages re-emerged. Beliefs diverged. Customs adapted to local needs. The world became complex again, and complexity, while messy, proved resilient. The empire's downfall demonstrated that resilience does not come from domination. It comes from flexibility. Looking back, historians noticed that the empire's greatest weakness was also its greatest pride: scale. The larger it became, the harder it was to govern wisely. Information moved slowly. Decisions lagged behind reality. Local crises became imperial emergencies too late to solve effectively. By the time orders arrived, conditions had changed. The empire governed yesterday's world. And yesterday's solutions rarely solve today's problems. This delay created a cycle of overreaction. Small issues were ignored until they became large. When they finally demanded attention, the response was extreme: mass mobilization, harsh laws, sweeping punishments. These measures restored control briefly but deepened long-term resentment. The empire oscillated between neglect and oppression. There was no middle ground. As authority weakened, people learned to live without it. They stopped waiting for imperial solutions. They stopped expecting protection. They adapted independently. This adaptation made the empire increasingly irrelevant. A power that is no longer needed cannot survive. Eventually, the empire existed only in records and ruins. Its administrators disappeared. Its military traditions diluted. Its centralized economy fractured. What remained was influence without control, memory without force. Yet even in absence, the empire shaped the future. Later civilizations inherited its lessons, even if they did not always understand them. They adopted its tools, law, bureaucracy, military organization, but modified them to suit smaller scales. Some succeeded. Some failed, but none repeated its dominance exactly. Because dominance on that scale demands sacrifices few societies are willing to make for long. The ancient empire's story forces a difficult conclusion. Power can solve problems quickly, but it creates new problems slowly. The empire chose speed over sustainability, control over cooperation, expansion over balance. Each choice made sense in isolation. Together, they built a structure that could only move forward. And when forward was no longer possible, there was nowhere else to go. This is why the empire was too powerful to last. Not because power is dangerous, but because power, when unbalanced, narrows the future. It limits options. It hardens systems. It teaches leaders to trust strength more than wisdom. In the end, the empire did not collapse under the weight of its enemies. It collapsed under the weight of itself. By the time historians began writing with distance and clarity, the empire had already become an abstraction. No longer a lived reality, it was now a concept, used to explain the rise and fall of power, the limits of control, and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Yet behind the abstraction were millions of individual lives shaped by decisions made far beyond their reach. Farmers who paid taxes to support distant wars. Soldiers who fought for borders they would never see again. Citizens who trusted a system that outgrew its ability to serve them. The empire did not collapse in spite of these people. It collapsed because of how it treated them. As power concentrated at the center, everyday voices faded. Local concerns were filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Problems were simplified to fit imperial frameworks. Nuance was lost. Human complexity was reduced to administrative categories. This reduction made governance efficient, but brittle. When reality refused to fit those categories, the system broke. The empire's administrators were highly skilled at managing predictable challenges: taxation, conscription, infrastructure, logistics. But they struggled with uncertainty. Social shifts, cultural resistance, environmental stress. These did not fit neatly into reports and directives. Instead of adapting, the empire standardized further. Uniform solutions replaced local judgment. This deepened the gap between policy and reality. Communities learned to navigate around the system rather than through it. Compliance became performative. Loyalty became conditional. The empire was still powerful on paper. In practice, it was hollow. Another subtle force worked against it: generational change. The founders of the empire had lived through hardship. They understood why discipline mattered. Later generations inherited stability without struggle. They knew the rules, but not the reasons behind them. Traditions became rituals. Duty became obligation. Service became burden. Without shared purpose, unity frayed. Rulers attempted to restore cohesion through ideology, stories of destiny, divine favor, historical inevitability. These narratives worked for a time. But ideology cannot replace material stability. When taxes rose and security fell, belief eroded quickly. The empire's story of permanence collapsed under everyday reality. As belief faded, enforcement increased. This created a self-reinforcing cycle. The more force was used, the less legitimate authority became. The less legitimate authority became, the more force was required. Eventually, the cost exceeded the benefit. The empire reached a point where maintaining control consumed more resources than it generated. At that moment, collapse became a matter of time. What followed was not an explosion, but a withdrawal. Officials abandoned posts. Garrisons disbanded. Records ceased. The empire retreated from places it could no longer afford to govern. This retreat was rational. But it was also irreversible. Once authority withdraws, reasserting it is nearly impossible without rebuilding trust. The empire had long since abandoned trust as a strategy. And so, its story ended not with conquest, but with abandonment. The world adapted. Life continued. New systems emerged. Some were weaker. Some were stronger. But all were shaped by the absence of what had once been dominant. The empire left behind more than ruins. It left behind a warning written across generations. That power without accountability isolates itself. That efficiency without empathy fractures societies. That dominance without adaptability collapses inward. This ancient empire was too powerful to last because it mastered control but neglected connection. And no civilization survives without both. Even centuries later, the lessons of the empire persisted, not only in ruins and chronicles, but in the very fabric of civilization itself. Political theorists, military strategists, and philosophers all looked to its story for insight. They studied its victories and marveled at its reach, yet the collapse fascinated them more than conquest. For in its fall lay a universal truth: unchecked power carries the seeds of its own destruction. The empire's initial brilliance had been extraordinary. It had transformed a small city-state into a superpower capable of projecting influence across vast lands. Its armies were disciplined, its administration innovative, its economy expansive. It set a standard for what an organized civilization could achieve. No contemporary rival could match its combination of organization, force, and vision. But brilliance, unchecked, becomes brittle. As the empire expanded, it relied increasingly on systems rather than human judgment. Hierarchies grew deeper. Orders moved slower. Minor issues multiplied into crises before the center even recognized them. While the empire's infrastructure allowed unprecedented mobility of armies and resources, it also created dependence. Without central coordination, the machine could not operate. When crises emerged, natural disasters, rebellions, resource shortages, the empire's rigidity prevented flexible response. Generals waited for commands. Governors adhered strictly to regulations. Local populations had little agency. Efficiency, once the empire's strength, became its vulnerability. Simultaneously, the human cost of maintaining dominance increased. Soldiers were stretched thinner. Tax burdens grew heavier. Local resentment simmered and occasionally erupted into rebellion. The very populations whose labor and loyalty had built the empire became the source of instability. Worse, the empire's success changed its culture. Leaders, insulated by wealth and authority, grew increasingly disconnected from reality. They judged challenges by precedent rather than observation. Innovation was often punished. Obedience was rewarded above insight. The same discipline that had produced conquests now stifled adaptation. Over time, internal divisions deepened. Provincial governors acted independently, sometimes in defiance of central authority. Military commanders wielded political influence that rivaled that of rulers themselves. Factions formed, competing for resources and favor. Civil conflict became inevitable, not from foreign attack, but from structural imbalance. Externally, enemies adapted. Where the empire had once crushed opposition with overwhelming force, rival states learned to exploit its weaknesses. Guerrilla tactics, strategic alliances, and decentralized resistance became more effective than frontal assaults. The empire's methods, once unmatched, were outpaced by evolving circumstances. The economy also faltered. Maintaining vast armies, roads, and infrastructure required immense resources. As expansion slowed and local production lagged, deficits grew. Inflation, resource shortages, and logistical failures undermined both civilian life and military readiness. The empire's very scale, once a source of power, became unsustainable. Ultimately, the collapse of this ancient superpower was not the result of a single catastrophic event, but the culmination of long-term systemic pressure. It is a story of complexity outgrowing its capacity to be managed, of ambition outpacing wisdom, of power that became too great for those who wielded it to control. And yet, its legacy endured. Its innovations in administration, law, and military organization influenced generations to come. Its architectural marvels inspired awe. Its history provided cautionary lessons for all who would seek dominance without balance. The empire's rise and fall is a testament to a simple but profound principle: true power is not only measured by conquest, wealth, or control, but by the ability to endure. Those civilizations that forget this lesson, no matter how mighty, risk consuming themselves from within. As time passed, The empire's influence extended beyond its political and military achievements. Its culture, language, and ideas continued to shape societies long after its authority had vanished. Administrative practices, legal codes, religious rituals, and even art forms were preserved, adapted, and transmitted by successor states. The empire had created a template for civilization itself, one that others could follow, modify, or reject. Yet, ironically, the very mechanisms that ensured its cultural legacy had contributed to its political downfall. The empire relied heavily on formal structures, laws, bureaucracy, military hierarchies, and centralized control. While these systems allowed unprecedented efficiency and coordination, they also limited flexibility and adaptability. The more tightly the empire controlled its territories, the less capable it became of responding to unforeseen challenges. Change, inevitability, and external pressures exposed the brittleness of even the most formidable empire. Climatic shifts affected harvests. Population movements threatened border regions. Economic networks became unstable as trade routes faltered. And when internal divisions surfaced, whether through rebellion, corruption, or power struggles, the empire struggled to respond with the decisiveness that had defined its rise. Leadership itself became a double-edged sword. Early rulers had been pragmatic, ruthless when necessary, and visionary in their policies. Their authority relied not only on military power but on the trust and loyalty of their people. Later rulers, insulated by bureaucracy, wealth, and the aura of inherited legitimacy, often lacked the connection to the reality on the ground. Decisions were made according to tradition, protocol, or perception rather than necessity. As inefficiencies grew, so did reliance on coercion. Military power and fear were increasingly deployed to maintain compliance instead of loyalty. But fear is temporary. It does not cultivate allegiance or sustain institutions over decades. As the empire's authority weakened in remote regions, local populations adapted by creating autonomous governance structures. They no longer relied on, or feared, the distant capital. This decentralized adaptation highlighted the fatal flaw of the empire. It had conquered more than it could control, and it had centralized more than it could sustain. Expansion, which had once been its source of strength, became a burden. Efforts to maintain distant provinces drained resources, stretched the military, and heightened political tension at the center. Every campaign, every decree, and every tax collection became an exercise in balancing short-term gains against long-term vulnerability, a balance the empire could not maintain indefinitely. Ultimately, the empire's collapse was a slow-motion process. Provinces drifted away. Military campaigns failed or became symbolic. Leadership turned inward, obsessed with preserving prestige rather than responding effectively to crises. And as the weight of administrative complexity, military overextension, and social strain compounded, the system that had created unprecedented power began to unravel from within. Yet, even in collapse, the empire's imprint endured. It left lessons etched in history, architecture, law, and culture, reminders of both human potential and limitation. Its story warns that immense power, when unchecked and unbalanced, is inherently fragile. Its legacy reminds us that no empire, however mighty, can outlast the consequences of overreach, rigidity, and hubris. As the empire faded from political relevance, its memory continued to shape human imagination. Chroniclers, poets, and historians looked back on its rise and fall as both a cautionary tale and a source of fascination. Tales of its grandeur, towering cities, disciplined armies, and sprawling roads were told alongside accounts of its internal strife, corruption, and eventual decline. In this way, the empire lived on not as a functioning state, but as an idea, the embodiment of both ultimate power and inherent vulnerability. One of the most remarkable aspects of the empire was how it intertwined human ambition with systemic structure. Its founders had created institutions capable of managing vast populations, mobilizing resources, and enforcing laws over extraordinary distances. At first, these systems magnified human capability. They allowed the empire to respond to crises, project military power, and integrate diverse cultures more effectively than any predecessor. But systems, no matter how well designed, have limits. The empire's institutions were optimized for growth and control, not contraction or adaptation. Successive rulers applied standardized solutions to increasingly complex problems, assuming that what worked for one region would work for all. Local circumstances, cultural differences, and environmental changes were frequently ignored or suppressed. Over time, this rigidity became the empire's Achilles heel. As the empire expanded, it also became dependent on compliance and fear rather than genuine loyalty. Its laws, armies, and administrative machinery could enforce obedience, but they could not generate devotion. Citizens, soldiers, and local governors followed orders, but often lacked personal investment in the system's success. When the empire encountered internal crises or external pressures, this conditional allegiance could no longer sustain the structure. Generations of overextension compounded the problem. Provinces were incorporated faster than the central government could integrate them. Military campaigns drained resources and human capital. Taxation and labor demands increased, fueling resentment and rebellion. Meanwhile, rulers at the center, insulated by bureaucracy and wealth, increasingly misjudged conditions on the periphery. In the end, the empire's downfall was not a dramatic battle but a gradual erosion of capacity. It failed not because it lacked strength or ingenuity, but because its very success created vulnerabilities that could not be mitigated. The systems that had delivered unparalleled power ultimately became too rigid to survive. Yet even in decay, the empire shaped what followed. Its administrative models, military innovations, and legal frameworks influenced successor states for centuries. Its cultural achievements, art, architecture, literature, and religious institutions, continued to inspire. And its story, preserved through ruins and chronicles, became a reference point for understanding the fragility of concentrated power. The empire's narrative endures because it is timeless. It reminds us that power, no matter how great, is fragile when it outgrows adaptability, when strength replaces wisdom, and when fear substitutes for trust. Civilizations rise on ambition and ingenuity, but they endure only through balance, foresight, and humility. As the empire's shadow receded into history, its lessons became ever clearer. Its rise had been fueled by vision, discipline, and relentless ambition. Its fall was equally determined, not by external enemies alone, but by the consequences of its own scale, complexity, and overreach. It had achieved greatness beyond imagination, yet it had ignored one fundamental principle: no power is absolute, and no system is invulnerable. The empire teaches that the most potent force a civilization can wield, its ability to control, organize, and expand, can also be the seed of its undoing. When growth becomes an obsession, when central authority outweighs local agency, and when fear replaces loyalty, stability becomes an illusion. The empire's greatest victories, amassed through relentless expansion, became the very mechanisms that drained its strength. Even as its cities crumbled, its armies dissolved, and its bureaucracy faltered, the empire's influence persisted. Scholars and rulers in distant lands studied its methods. Architects replicated its monumental structures. Legal systems adopted its codes. Military leaders learned from both its brilliance and its failures. The empire survived in memory, in principle, and in inspiration, proof that even collapse cannot erase significance. Ultimately, the story of this ancient superpower is a paradox. It was too powerful to fail quickly, yet too powerful to endure indefinitely. Its extraordinary strength created dependence, rigidity, and expectations that the human and natural world could not sustain. In conquering everything, it constrained its own future. In dominating all, it limited its own adaptability. Its fate was a slow, inexorable decline, a process as instructive as it was inevitable. The empire reminds us that endurance requires balance as much as ambition, adaptability as much as strength, and legitimacy as much as fear. Power without these qualities, no matter how immense, is fleeting. Its ruins, its stories, and its enduring influence serve as a testament to human achievement and a warning to every civilization that dares to exceed the limits of sustainable control. And so, the empire that once seemed unstoppable now exists only as a lesson carved into history, that even the greatest power is impermanent, and that no civilization, no matter how mighty, can escape the consequences of its own excess. If you've been captivated by the story of the Hittites, the empire that challenged Egypt and survived, don't stop here. Hit like if you were amazed by their resilience, comment your thoughts on which Hittite strategy impressed you most, and subscribe to uncover more forgotten empires and untold histories that shaped the world. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next journey into the past.